$400 million years ago, the sharks and their relatives began an extraordinary evolution. Through the ages, their design and behavior have been honed to perfection. And today, these animals elicit more fear and fascination than any other creature in the sea, and perhaps on Earth. I think that's because we know so little of the way they live. They inhabit a world that we can only visit, and of course, they can be dangerous. I know because I've studied them and spent years trying to film their natural behavior. And it is that behavior that most fascinates me. There are nearly 900 different kinds of sharks and related species, the skates and stingrays, but only a handful are potentially harmful to man. The gray reef shark is one. These sharks exhibit a surprising and spectacular behavior that I learned about the hard way. I think it's impossible for me to tell you how I feel emotionally right now. This is the first time I've returned to Anahuac Atoll since the single most extraordinary event in my life took place in the lagoon right out there. I was scuba diving with a friend of mine at about 50 feet. It was a beautiful day, a beautiful dive. Everything was going according to plan, and I was taking still pictures. There was a variety of sharks around, and they were coming particularly close. And as a matter of fact, I remember thinking, boy, this is a great roll. I'm getting good close-ups of this fish. Then we reached the edge of the pinnacle, and several gray reef sharks appeared. One of them in particular, it was a 5-foot female, was going through a very dramatic posture where its nose was up, its pectoral fins were lowered, its mouth slightly open. And I looked at it, and my immediate reaction was that this was a warning I was seeing, that it is a threat posture. And the more I looked at it, the more injured it appeared, so I took its picture. The moment the strobe fired, so did the shark, and it broke out of the posture. Before the mirror in the camera even returned so that I could see through the viewfinder again, it had halved the distance between us. So all I could do was just push the camera out toward it. And at that point, it seemed like things were happening in slow motion. I could see the shark coming right at me. And right as it got to the camera, it started opening its mouth and pushed the camera to the side, which naturally presented my elbow. And again, in slow motion, it was as though it had rehearsed it 100 times, just grabbed my arm in its mouth, shook, and took off the top of my arm. And the shark swam away in the same posture. Now you might think this would keep me well away from sharks, but I know I caused that attack. I made a mistake. I ignored a clear warning from that shark, and I learned a great deal from the incident. I'm still learning. I now know you can predict certain behavior, like the threat posture. So I'm going to recreate that attack to show you what I mean. But this time I'll be fully protected by a stainless steel suit and plexiglass canopy, so neither the shark nor I will be hurt. This gray reef shark is swimming normally, but if I pursue it, it will change its swimming style into an exaggerated one, a warning for me to back off. As I chase the shark, its swimming speed slows. The pectoral fins on the side of its body are lowered, and it moves its head from side to side. That's a fully developed threat posture. I could stop right now and it would just swim away, but I'll keep pushing. This is exactly as I remember it 13 years ago, and I can't believe it's happening in front of me again. But I'm ready, at least in theory. That's the kind of dramatic behavior that cemented my long-standing interest in the chondrichthyans. the group that includes sharks, skates, stingrays, and the lesser-known chimeras. I've been lucky enough to film aspects of their lives that few people have ever seen. I think you'll be surprised by their diversity and abilities. I also think your image of a shark will change. I know mine has. For a start, they come in an amazing variety of shapes and sizes.
Oh, the shark has pretty teeth, dear, and he shows them very white. When the shark bites with his teeth, dear, scarlet billows start to spread. Fancy gloves, though, wears like heat, dear, so there's not a trace of red. On the sidewalk, Sunday mornings, lies a body oozing life. Someone sneaking round the corner. Is that someone back tonight?
All these creatures are sharks or their close relatives. So what makes a shark a shark? You've just seen a sample of their diversity, but there are a few characteristics that they all share. The key feature is their skeleton. It's made of cartilage, tough, flexible, and lighter than bone. Their most famous or infamous feature must be their teeth. Sharks' teeth are as varied as their body designs and razor sharp, and they have a unique means of keeping them that way. Like a spiky conveyor belt coming from well within the jaw, rows of new teeth emerge to replace the broken ones as often as every 2 weeks. As a matter of fact, their entire bodies are covered with tiny tooth-like scales called dermal denticles, which look similar to this. It makes a very tough skin that has even been used as sandpaper. Instead of a single pair of gill slits like other fish, sharks have 5, 6, or even 7. And unlike most fishes, which reproduce by releasing countless eggs and sperm into the water, sharks have internal fertilization like mammals, using these claspers. But it's their sensory systems that I find the most astonishing. Sharks have all 5 senses we have, plus a couple more. One is unique in the animal kingdom, and it's called the ampullae of Lorenzini. We're still learning how they use this system, but we do know the basics. All living things generate electrical fields. Sharks have developed an incredibly acute sense to detect these tiny charges at close range. Small pits concentrated on the lower side of the head are the openings to this complex electroreception system. As the shark nears its prey, these microelectric fields envelop its head and enter the small pits, passing into jelly-filled canals. The canals lead to a sac lined with tiny receptive hair cells. Here, the electricity is transformed into nervous impulses and sent through nerve bundles to the brain. The entire system, made up of thousands of ampullae, creates a fantastic directional antenna telling the shark precisely where its prey is without the need for sight, smell, or touch. Here are the pits on a live shark. The clearest use of electroreception I know of is in the Hawaiian Islands, where juvenile hammerheads find otherwise invisible prey. When I set out to film this, I had no idea what I would see, since no one even knew it happened. But I suspected it strongly enough to take a gamble. As night falls on the reef, most daytime fish hide in the coral to sleep. But these wrasse have a unique way of bedding down. This is a good way to avoid predators. Unless hammerheads are around. You can clearly see his technique. Right there, he drops his lower jaw, dragging it through the sand to scoop out the unwary fish. And that strange head? It creates a wide surface for the ampullae to spread across, so it can scan the sand for buried fish, like a broad metal detector. Sometimes all the commotion brings sleeping fish out to see what's up. Not a good idea. Sharks use electroreception not only to find food, but to locate mates. Here in Mexico, where the desert meets the Sea of Cortez, I filmed the breeding behavior of stingrays, which are essentially flattened sharks. For about 2 weeks each winter, female stingrays come here to mate. They may band together, often creating huge piles of up to 100, where they wait until they're ready. But the males are always game, so a reluctant female uses her spine to keep them at bay. Or she may hide by burying. But with their electroreceptive talents, the males can detect the buried females and, with persistence, they eventually mate. It may seem unchivalrous, but the male bites her to hold on and has developed special teeth which help him keep his grip. Near his tail are the male's claspers, which are extensions of the pelvic fins that sharks and rays use like a penis. He has 2 of these, but he only uses 1 at a time. It's easy to understand how stingrays find each other in a shallow bay, but what about sharks that swim in open water? A chance encounter in Hawaii's Leeward Islands provided a clue. I was filming gray reef sharks when I noticed a group of reef whitetips swimming in unusually close formation. A female was being pursued by 5 or 6 males, so I followed. Finally, one of the males swims right up to her and right there, grabs her pectoral fin, and courtship begins. Although it looks a bit violent, females have a thicker skin than males to compensate for this. The other males never left the scene. Scientists suspect that females release a scent, like a mammal in heat, and the males can detect it from great distances. And there's stiff competition. I couldn't believe my luck. I'd never seen anything like it. Far from terrifying, this was a beautiful and actually quite sensual picture of a malign creature. These gray reef sharks were in a more advanced stage of reproduction. This was the same species that attacked me, but ironically, I feel more comfortable encountering a school of gray reefs rather than just one. They seem to have a purpose, and it doesn't involve me. These are all females and probably all pregnant. They enter shallow water to release their young where there are fewer large predators. It's suspected they stop feeding shortly before pupping, and biologist Rocky Strong has an unorthodox way of finding out if that's true.
Got that? Yeah. Okay, lift him up. All right, sir. Here we go. Okay. Fast, guys. We gotta go. Okay, I got this one. Okay, one more up. Okay, all right. Okay, she's pretty placid. Good. There you go. Look at that. Oh, she's biting down on it a little. Can you? There it is. You're just gonna have to hold back on it. Okay.
Okay, she still looks all right. Tell you one thing, it's a nice technique as long as it's you with the arm down the throat.
Okay, I'm down. I'm down. I'm in it. That moist absolutely nothing in the stomach. I don't feel anything. I don't even feel any scales or warm too.
You've got your arm inside of a live shark.
She looks okay though.
What does it feel like?
It's slimy. Absolutely nothing in here. Nothing. No scales, no otoliths. Nothing. Let's get her back in the water.
She's not reacting.
Yeah, she looks good.
Boy, she's still closing like crazy. She's got my hand between her snout and pipe. Okay?
Okay. Okay, you got that undone? Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. Fine. Scientists used to kill the animal to sample its gut. At least Rocky leaves them with just a sore mouth. It does appear they stop feeding, but why? I found a possible answer in the Florida Keys. Like the gray reefs, bonnethead sharks migrate each summer to the shallow waters to give birth. Baby bonnetheads, like humans, are fed before birth through a placenta. It's the most advanced form of reproduction, and no other fish does it quite like this. You can see the umbilical cords trailing from this female. I felt privileged to witness this intimate moment. It certainly counters the notion that sharks are merely ruthless killers when you see them giving birth. In fact, now it was clear to me why many sharks lose the impulse to feed. It prevents the babies from becoming their next meal. Once born, they're on their own. None of the sharks provide parental care, unless you consider not eating your young parental care. Live-bearing animals invest a lot of time and energy to produce only a few young, but their offspring are well-developed and much more likely to survive. The pups stay in the shallow bay for a few weeks to grow larger and stronger, but I was amazed to see that within moments of birth, they're just like miniature versions of the adults, and just as agile and alert. That obviously isn't the case here with these baby sharks. They just hatched from eggs and are completely uncoordinated. Their frantic behavior may last several days. This is an adult of the same species, a type of cat shark, curiously called a chained dogfish. They live at about 1,000 feet in the western Atlantic. When I decided to film egg laying, the most primitive form of reproduction in sharks, I chose this beautiful shark because she has such a clever way of laying her eggs. When she's ready, long sticky tendrils attached to the egg cases emerge from her body. Then it's just a matter of finding a suitable hitching post to help her pull out the eggs. Secured, both the tendrils and the egg case harden, forming a protective capsule for the young shark. The female goes through this ritual, laying 2 eggs at a time, every 2 weeks throughout the year. She fertilizes them with sperm that she can store in her body for up to 12 months. Some of these egg cases wash up on the beach. They're called mermaid's purses, and it is inside that the baby shark develops. You can see its heart working at only 2 months. And by 5 months, it begins to look somewhat like a fish, only at this stage its feathery gills are on the outside. The embryo begins to resemble a chained dogfish at 8 months. After hatching, its only protection is its deep water habitat. In the shallow reef, I'm afraid it would be eaten immediately. And at 10 months, freedom at last. The most beautiful and intricate egg case I've ever seen belongs to the horn shark. And this one is in the shallow water. Apparently, the mother uses the tough spirals encircling the case to wedge it into the rocks for safekeeping. The horn shark is common in the shallow waters off the coast of California, where it feeds on invertebrates like spiny sea urchins. Its rubbery mouth has flattened teeth to deal with this prickly lunch. And if you don't like sharks, this little guy might change your mind. After hatching, it darkens to blend with its surroundings, but it has an even better defense, a sharp spine in front of each dorsal fin, just in case. Meet the angel shark. Clearly, the spine works. I have to admit, the angel shark is one of my favorites. I was astonished as I watched this thing feed. This has to be one of the most bizarre sharks I've ever seen. It's also the focus of one man's research. Pursuing his interest in feeding behavior, when his arm isn't down a shark's throat, Rocky Strong studies the angel shark around California's Channel Islands. He's interested in what triggers that explosive feeding response, and again, he's designed a unique way of finding out. Rocky sets up a pulley system that allows him to pass a variety of items over a resting angel shark, trying to determine just what its cue is. He knows it's an ambush predator and may lie motionless for days until an unsuspecting fish ventures too close. Rocky has passed scores of different prey overhead, including rubber models like this one, and he thinks that it's mainly sight that triggers the angel shark. It takes virtually everything, then decides whether to keep it. Angel sharks get their name because of the flattened wing-like pectoral fins on the side of their bodies, certainly not for their behavior. I'm just glad they don't get much bigger. While the angel shark relies on camouflage and surprise, this animal stalks its prey, and its technique earned it the nickname the Night Shocker. Electric rays not only detect electricity, but generate it, lots of it, maybe enough to knock a man out.
When there's an electric ray around at nighttime, we flicker the dive lights. So I knew there was an electric ray nearby. And I held my regulator in my mouth, and I started to rise up, and I rose right into an electric ray that was hovering above me. And it went zap, 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 3 times. The first one was really powerful. Then about a second later, there was another shock, not as powerful. Then about a second later, there was another shock, not as powerful. And then either the electric ray swam away, or I had enough sense to get away from it, but that was it.
Well, it's been my experience filming animals, especially fish, that you get near them, they run from you. These guys are just the opposite. As soon as you start getting close to them, not only do they not run, but they actually flip around and attack.
Probably anything that's going to come up and bother an electric ray will be deterred very quickly.
Yeah.
You were wondering why electric rays don't swim very fast.
Yeah.
And I think the bottom line is they don't have to. Yeah. I think they operate at the speed of light in that regard.
In the Eastern Pacific, Dick Bray and Chris Lowe are studying this ray's electrical output. Dr. Bray discovered that they use electric discharges not only for defense, but also for feeding, and I agreed to join them on one of their research trips. I would later regret it. The scientists have developed a special wand to record the electrical pulses generated by the ray. Those short popping sounds are electrical discharges used as defense. But when the ray is presented with a fish, the discharge is different. Using electroreception, it locates its prey and then releases a longer burst of electricity to stun it. It can also fire a photographic flashbulb. In the daytime, when the rays were recharging their batteries, I found that science and filmmaking don't always mix. They went for me, and I didn't enjoy it. Apparently, they preferred the slight electrical output of my camera housing to the scientist's electrodes. It wasn't that painful, but it was frightening because I knew at any moment it could get a lot worse. And it was a sharp reminder of why these fish are so difficult to study and film. Perhaps less shocking, but still surprising, was the feeding behavior of reef whitetip sharks in Costa Rica. This population spends most of the day resting, right out in the open. Elsewhere, I'd always seen them in caves. Before scientists observed them lying motionless like this, they believed that sharks would suffocate if they stopped swimming, that they lacked muscles to pump water over their gills. The reef whitetips may move only a few meters, then gently land back on the sand. They seemed to do little more than lie around, so I considered moving on. But that would have been a mistake. You need patience to learn much about sharks, and this time, mine would pay off. As the day ended, activity picked up. A 35-foot whale shark, the largest fish in the sea, passed overhead. It was a young one. They can grow to 50 feet. This one sported a beard of remoras, harmless hitchhikers. It was heading offshore, probably to feed on plankton. And at night, the whitetips came alive. Natural hunting and feeding in sharks has rarely been seen, and now I was really glad I stayed around. The lazy daytime behavior of the whitetips left me totally unprepared for what I saw at night. They reminded me of eels slithering through the reef. It was difficult to film them. I never knew where to point the camera next. Sharks are full of surprises, but for me, the greatest surprise came in 1990. That's when a major discovery gripped scientists and an entire community in Southern California, and the press loved it.
It's called Megachasma pelagios, megamouth for short. Sea creature millions of years old, yet we never knew it existed until recently. It had never been photographed until yesterday. 14 feet long and 1,200 pounds of mystery. But today, marine biologists were trying to unravel some of that mystery.
Not like any shark that you've ever seen. The skin feels the same because they have these dermal denticles, little like teeth all over the skin. And the roughness of the skin is there. The fins are all right, but the mouth is all wrong. You know, you think of a typical shark, kind of cornical with big teeth. This has a big, huge mouth with just rubbery lips. Actually, the newscaster was wrong. It was over 16 feet long and 8 feet in girth. I measured it. I'll never forget that moment, being the first to see an animal species underwater. This was only the 6th megamouth ever found and the first studied alive. In fact, the species had escaped detection altogether until 1976. But equally impressive was the public's reaction. I've never seen such an outpouring of sympathy for a shark. Hundreds of people turned up and spoke out for Megamouth to be released, which is exactly what happened, but not before it was fitted with an ultrasonic transmitter, and there it is, the white tube right under the dorsal fin. I had waited all day for its release, hoping Megamouth would survive its capture, and I have to say that it gave me a tremendous feeling seeing it head straight down to its deep water home. And that feeling was shared by Doctors Don Nelson and Bob Lavenberg, who were equally excited about this rare find, but from a scientific point of view.
Which way?
He's off the starboard bow. You know, Don, this thing is at about 145 meters right now. How deep has it gone? What's the deepest depth it's gone?
We've seen it on this trip up to about 160 meters approximately.
The transmitters were telling them that the shark is a vertical migrator, traveling from the surface to the depths each day, probably following a thick layer of plankton that it feeds on. I think Megamouth is a poignant reminder that even with all our sophisticated technology, there's still a lot to learn about our oceans. Imagine a 16-foot animal going undetected for so long. What else is down there? These thin layers of rock in central Montana hold the remains of what used to be down there. Many believe that the oceans are the Earth's last frontier. Dr. Dick Lund agrees, but his oceans have become stone. He reads these ancient layers like the pages of a book, gaining startling insight into the history of sharks. It's ironic that here in these dusty layers, this man's finding perhaps more species of sharks than anyone working in the oceans. This was once a shallow tropical bay. 320 million years ago, it was south of the equator, filled with sea life, and the dominant fish were the sharks.
You know, every time I turn over a rock around here, I have the chance of finding something very, very different. A new piece of a puzzle, a new part of recreating a bay, traveling backward in time to a time when the sharks were kings of the ocean, kings of the rivers, kings of the lakes.
When these layers were deposited, the dinosaurs were well over 100 million years in the future. The first mammals were 250 million years away, and insects were just learning to fly. Dick Lund is finding that sharks were already incredibly diverse, and what he is learning is changing our stereotyped view of sharks. He's found they experimented with myriad designs, and what we have today is the stripped-down, streamlined version incorporating all the successful features of the past.
I've been digging here for 22 years, and I've always needed help. Recently, I've been happy to have the support of volunteers from Earthwatch that have made a big difference, because there's a lot of rock that needs to be moved for every fish you find. I don't think much of the use of the term primitive in regard to sharks. For one thing, I think the Office of Naval Research certainly wouldn't call their sensory systems primitive. I think they're still trying to design systems as good as shark systems. They're not primitive. There's nothing primitive about them. My sharks are 320 million years older? Okay. If you want to play that game, you could call them primitive, more primitive than the ones we have today. But there's another argument if you really want to use it. Human species has only been around for maybe, 400,000 years? Maybe some people would argue 40,000 years. That's fairly primitive.
He starts by finding the pieces, laying them all out, and assembling the complete fossil. Then he turns it over to his wife, Wendy.
The most fun is actually in doing the reconstruction, getting it down on paper and doing the actual inking and the stippling and the shading and bringing everything into complete detail. And seeing the final thing and see all of the wonderful things that you just don't see in modern animals anymore, and just breathe some life into the dry old bones. And these things are just not dead anymore, they're alive.
In the same way that sharks are the distillation hundreds of millions of years of experiments in how to build a predator, the chimerids are also the highly specialized result of hundreds of millions of years of experimentation.
But for the chimeras, the experiments seem to have stopped eons ago. The chimera is probably the most primitive of the living sharks today. It's a paradox that such a beautiful creature lives at such depth and darkness that it cannot show off its true colors. They're egg layers, but unlike the cat shark with its elaborate procedure, the chimeras simply drop their eggs. The males have an interesting feature. That fleshy lobe between his eyes is a third clasper. He uses it during mating, allegedly to hold on.
Now, one of the other lessons you learn is that extinctions have hit the sharks many times. They've come through it each time. And fundamentally, species come and species go, but a good design like that of sharks goes on forever.
And finally, here is the culmination of all that evolution has given the sharks. This is a tiger shark, streamlined to perfection, among the most advanced of the entire group. Most of the sharks we've seen are not threatening to man. Tiger sharks are different, extremely efficient and dangerous predators. I've traveled 1,000 miles northwest of the main Hawaiian Islands to witness a specific event that, for me, sums up all the sophistication that the sharks possess. Each year, thousands of laysan and black-footed albatross gather on this remote island to breed. I've timed my arrival to film the baby bird's first and most crucial flight. It will mark the beginning of adulthood for some and a tragic end for others. And dark shadows have timed their arrival for the same event. This annual drama is a poignant example of nature and natural selection at work. The baby albatross prepare for this journey by strengthening their wings in the trade winds, practicing flight on the beach. They couldn't possibly know what fate awaits them if their first flight ends in the shallows. The sharks would snatch the birds from the surface and crush or drown them. Sometimes they'd just release them in circle, presumably waiting for the birds to die. Then they returned to eat them. The shark's technique allowed me to get these underwater shots. I would swim under the injured and dead birds and wait for the sharks to return. Before I decided to put myself in this position, I watched the sharks feed for over a week and noticed they were ignoring common prey like monk seals and sea turtles. It became clear to me that they were only interested in the birds. And so I entered the water with one of the most impressive predators the earth has ever known. The sharks noticed me, but for that week allowed me into their world and showed absolutely no aggressive behavior toward me. I came here hoping to film this predation, and I should have been thrilled that I got it. But after spending weeks with these baby birds, I was left with very mixed emotions. Still, I could appreciate the tiger shark's strategy. They're never seen here except the 2 weeks when the albatross fledge. How do they know when to arrive? How do they navigate to the same beach year after year? And how are they homing in on the birds? You have to admire such a skillful predator taking advantage of a large bounty of easy prey. They do it by making use of a whole battery of sensory systems, and that's what makes them so successful. My experience with sharks has left scars, but much more importantly, it has given me knowledge about these beautifully designed creatures. And I believe knowledge dissipates fear. I'm convinced that the more we know about them, the less we will fear them, and we'll realize they are not our enemies.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation from the National Geographic Video Library.
Think you have what it takes to brave Alaska, where an average winter day could be 50 below zero, and your closest neighbor could be 50 miles away, where the mail only comes 3 times a year, but there are more recipes for moose than you can count. Sound tough? It is, but that's a small price to pay for independence, and you've got to be tough if you're braving Alaska.